Yeah, again, I stick into the classics here, coronavirus versus Liberty.
Our greatest hits.
Unfortunately, again, it's one of those things that very few people are actually talking about. I think everybody right now is just willing to give their liberty away. I've got a subtitle for this one, and I am talking about de facto versus de jure martial law and the escalation that we had in the last week. As I predicted last week, I said that other states, other communities would follow the LA model, and sure enough, they did. And then what happened was the state of California decided to escalate things up another notch with what's being called shelter in place. And I have the text for that particular order as well. So I'm going to get right to it. So we've got the executive order that the governor of California issued a few days ago. It was actually very soon after we aired our show. March 4th is when the executive order was I'm sorry, not March 4th. That's talking about the state of emergency.
Now,
Um,
is this modeled on the Los Angeles order that we looked at last week?
it is, it is, and it isn't. That's the point. Is it actually hasn't. This is the escalation. So
Okay.
the Los Angeles order that we discussed last week, that one applied to things like, for instance, bars, nightclubs, movie theaters. That's pretty standard now. That's kind of where we are in Arizona. Although in Arizona, Governor Ducey has stipulated that counties that have not had any reports of the coronavirus, they are not affected by his executive order at this time. There's only 4 counties left in Arizona that aren't affected by that, but he essentially copied LA. I mean,
I
for all
see.
intents and purposes, he copied LA. The 4 counties that are not affected in Arizona are all very small counties. The largest one is Mojave County. There's only 200,000 people in Mojave County. These are small counties. So there's only 4 counties left in Arizona that haven't been affected by the governor's order here. But in terms of California, this was an escalation. So we've got the justifications here, and then it says, now therefore I, Gavin Newsom, governor of the state of California, in accordance with the authority vested in me by the state constitution and statutes of the state of California, and in particular government code sections 8567, 8627, and 8665, do hereby issue the following order to become effective immediately. Hereby ordered to preserve the public health and safety and to ensure the healthcare delivery system is capable of serving on and prioritizing those at the highest risk and vulnerability. All residents are directed to immediately heed the current state public health directives, which I ordered the Department of Health to develop for the current statewide status of COVID-19. These directives are consistent with the March 19, 2020 memorandum on identification of essential critical infrastructure workers during COVID-19 response, found at link, that's a Homeland Security link.
Okay.
So these directives follow the order of the state public health officer from March 1920. And to protect public health, I, as state public health officer and director of the California Department of Public Health, order all individuals living in the state of Arizona to stay home
California.
or at their, yeah, state of California, to stay home or at their place of residence, except as needed to maintain continuity of operations of the federal critical infrastructure sectors as outlined at the link. So what you have is everybody is now starting to follow this particular order. I believe Pennsylvania just implemented this as well. There's also, I believe, Dallas County, which includes obviously Dallas, metropolitan area of Dallas. It's like dominoes. So just as what happened with LA and everybody started copying the LA model, this is sort of a crystal ball into the future of what's happening as far as the coronavirus's effect. So yeah, we're looking at lockdowns in statewide, citywide, countywide, depending on the jurisdictions you live in right now. And this is quite an escalation
Now, you said
in
that this
response
was an
to Corona.
escalation. Yeah. So what is the big difference between this and the Los Angeles order from last week?
Yeah, so the big difference is the shelter in place order. Under the Los Angeles order, you didn't have you could still technically go to work as long as you weren't involved in one of those industries that were specifically outlined in that order, such as being a worker at a bar, or being at a restaurant where you were not doing deliveries or pickup, bowling alleys, arcades, things of that nature. Those were the only things that were actually shut down. So people still had freedom of movement. Now, what this order does is it says that if you are not in a quote unquote critical infrastructure job, you're not supposed to be going out. You are in lockdown. And that's why I have my little subsection there about de facto versus de jure martial law. De facto martial law simply means military rule. That's all it means. But the connotation of martial law is exactly along the lines of what's happening here. Your freedom of movement are suspended. You're no longer supposed to be going outside. And it says here, if I can get to the right section, this order shall be enforceable pursuant to California law, including but not limited to Government Code Section 8665. And the natural question is, what is Government Code Section 8665? What does it say? What does it mean? Well, I just happen to have it here for you. So let me bring it up. And this is from the California Code. When I first saw this, I was like, what are they talking about? Is that a federal statute? What is that? So no, this is a California state code. This is from the California Legislative Information Site, which has all of their state laws. And here is Section 8665. It says, any person who violates any of the provisions of this chapter, or who refuses or willfully neglects to obey any lawful order or regulation promulgated or issued as provided in this chapter, shall be guilty of a misdemeanor, and upon conviction thereof shall be punishable by a fine of not to exceed $1,000, or by imprisonment for not to exceed 6 months, or by both such fine and imprisonment. So you can get up to 6 months in jail and $1,000 fine if you violate this.
So the chapter is called the California Emergency Services Act. So I'm assuming that this empowers the governor to issue emergency orders in the case of some kind of a disaster, whether it's a natural disaster or something like the coronavirus.
Right. It's under what they're Title II, which it says Government of the State of California, Division 1, General Chapter 7, California Emergency Services Act. Okay. So I'm not familiar with what Title II, what else that refers to in the California, California law, but
sure, but it's the California State Code. So,
but my point is that this is a criminal statute. So right. Basically, what this does is this criminalizes otherwise law-abiding citizens who, if they are in violation of the curfew, then they can be arrested. They can be fined. They can be arrested, or they can have both. And again, this is quite an escalation of what's been going on with the limitations that are in response to the coronavirus. And as I have the little ticker at the bottom of the screen, this is, I think, very much de facto martial law. Now, what is actual martial law? What is de jure martial law? Well, I found a very good article here from Newsweek that actually talks about how this is supposed to work, or at least the most recent thinking on it from the most recent military perspective. So this is a Newsweek article. It's dated March 20th. It says, inside the U.S. military's plans to stop civil disturbances amid coronavirus pandemic, something they haven't done in 30 years. Now, that's not exactly true. We do have the example of Katrina, where there was the military was involved with Katrina. It wasn't just the National Guard. The National Army was involved with that. Says, but with the National Guard now active in 22 states and governors continue to declare more severe emergency measures daily, the U.S. military is preparing forces to assume a larger role in the coronavirus response, including the controversial mission of quelling civil disturbances and enforcing the law, a mission that the military has not engaged in for almost 30 years. Again, that's not exactly true. In military circles, opinion is split over whether federal forces should muscle their way in to do more. And I would point out that this is exactly what the mayor of New York is actually calling for. I did see him on CNN calling for the military to take over, quote unquote. Back to the article. State governors and their respective National Guard units, not the federal government and the active duty military. Again, state governors and their respective National Guard units, not the federal government and the active duty military, are primarily responsible for handling domestic emergencies. That's the law. It's also common sense, since local officials are always closer to a crisis and generally more familiar with the people affected. And this is a Newsweek article, and I'm going to read that again. State governors and their respective National Guard units, not the federal government and the active duty military, are primarily responsible for handling domestic emergencies. That's the law, and it's also common sense, since local officials are always closer to a crisis and generally more familiar with the people affected. I feel like I should read that a third time, because the thing is, I don't think people understand this. I really feel like people don't understand this.
So when they say National Guard units are responsible, the National Guard is the military. It's not.
It is and it isn't. That's the point. The National Guard can be the military in terms of they can be nationalized, but
they are military units
up to the point that they are federalized. They are fulfilling the role of the militia. They're not the military.
Okay, but a militia is a military unit, right? They're not law enforcement. There's a qualitative distinction between law enforcement, say, and the military. And I understand that this isn't the U.S. military, but to say that these are not military units is really splitting hairs, and I don't even know if that's an accurate.
Well, it's not. I don't think it's fair to say that's splitting hairs, because the National Guard, especially even under the president, the National Guard can be used as a domestic tool, if you will.
Right. Okay.
Let's go back for a second. Let's talk about, for instance, like desegregation of schools. Okay.
Right.
And what happened in Little Rock and things like that. Okay. Because that's a good example. All right.
Right.
So you had a situation in Little Rock where basically the governor of the state was flouting the federal law, federal mandate that schools desegregate. And what happened was the governor tried to use the National Guard to bar Black students from going to school. The mayor of the city appealed to the president. And what the president ended up doing was he federalized the National Guard to enforce the law. And then he sent in 101st Airborne to essentially put bayonets to their back and make sure they did it. That's what happened. Okay, that's what actually happened. So so rather than having the 101st Airborne go in and do it, you see what I'm saying? And you say it's splitting hairs, but it's actually kind of important, because it's an important distinction that the national military, the regular army, gets does not enforce domestic laws. Period. Whether they're federal, whether they're state, whether they're local, whatever, they don't do that. That's the role of the National Guard, and the National Guard inherits that role because of the Constitution and because of the provisions for the militia, which state that the militia is supposed to be used to deal with law enforcement. That's what it says. So that's the constitutional issue there.
Okay. It seems to me that the National Guard is essentially, or you have the National Guard and the Army Reserves, but in the case of the National Guard, these are state level units, just like you have the Arizona National Guard, the Arizona Air National Guard, and so on. This is the state's military. And so if the governor is using the National Guard to enforce the law instead of state troopers and local police, that is already martial law. right?
That's an interesting perspective, but that's not exactly. I don't think that's exact. Okay, that's again. It actually goes back to my ticker when you're talking about de facto versus de jure. So de facto, I think you're correct. I think de facto, honestly, de facto. My point is de facto goes all the way back to with no National Guard, and the police are enforcing curfews and things like that. To me, that is de facto martial law, because the connotation is we're limiting your ability to assemble, we're limiting your ability to travel, we're limiting your fundamental rights, their most basic human rights. We're limiting. It doesn't really matter who's doing it, right? It doesn't really matter if it's a police officer or if it's a soldier, all right? And then the National Guard is considered somewhere in between, even though, yes, they are soldiers, but legally speaking, the de jure part, they aren't. You know what I mean? They are militia.
Sure.
They are citizen soldiers by definition. That is our tradition. That's what we refer to them as. They are citizen soldiers. They are part of our community. Okay, they are not from the 100. It's not like Little Rock where the 101st Airborne is coming in from God knows where, right? Okay, these are people that live in your own community. These are people that work beside you in your own community. They are citizen soldiers, and that's why they are the ones that have the primary responsibility to deal with a situation like this. So when we're talking about 100% de jure martial law, we're talking about the regular Army. We're talking about the regular Navy, the Marine Corps, you know what I mean? The Air Force. Those elements getting involved directly with law enforcement and doing something like enforcing a curfew, which I think a lot of these governors and mayors, that's what they want. It's exactly what they want, because they know their own police force is inadequate. And they also know the National Guard is not necessarily adequate. There was actually a pretty good article, I don't have it up right now, where the head of the Arizona National Guard was talking about the current mission they have in Arizona, which is to help with the food supply. That's all they're doing right now. So the first thing they did was they're helping staff the local food bank. Okay, so that's the first thing that they're doing. And one of the things that he mentioned, because people, of course, are asking for escalation. There are people right now, just ready to give all their freedoms away, and they're asking for escalation. And one of the things that the head of the actual commander of the Arizona National Guard brought up, which I thought was great, and that he said, was you have to realize a lot of my people are in critical infrastructure. They're citizens. A lot of them are police officers, firefighters, doctors, nurses, you know what I mean? Medical technicians. And if I start activating them, they're not going to be able to do those primary jobs anymore. You know what I mean? Right. So there is a fundamental difference between the regular military, active duty military, and the National Guard, legally and practically. Legally and practically, there's a big difference. They are similar, obviously, to the reserves. I myself served in the Navy Reserve. And interestingly enough, I would like to mention, part of this also comes down to a law called posse comitatus. And posse comitatus is a law that basically says the Army, and it does say the Army, is not supposed to be used for domestic law enforcement. And there are exceptions to that. They make exceptions. That's why we have the term war on drugs and things like that. There are exceptions that are made, but they're not supposed to be used. Interestingly enough, it is just the Army that's specified in that law. And I know there are legal interpretations that say that applies to the Air Force as well, because the Air Force was part of the Army, but that does not apply to the Navy and the Marine Corps. And I don't know if you remember, but back in the LA riots in the 90s, they actually did send in the Marines. And I think that's one of the reasons why, is because posse comitatus does not specifically bars. It's a law that specifically bars the Army from being involved in domestic law enforcement. But they did actually send the Marines in during the LA riots. So that's probably the last point that I'll bring up there.
I didn't realize that the Marines had been involved in suppressing the LA riots. So what's the big takeaway here? It seems like you're obviously against this, but
I've said this before. I've said this before in the last time I brought this up.
Okay.
I'm asking questions, okay, because a lot of people aren't. And one of the big takeaways is that part of the article that I read 3 times, and I read that very deliberately multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
The primary function, I mean, the primary organization that is supposed to be dealing with domestic emergencies is the state government. It is the National Guard. It is your local police department. It is your state police department. It is not the Army. And people like the mayor of New York, like actor Sean Penn of all people, I saw him too, who are advocating for this military takeover and having no idea what they're talking about. They have to be questioned. They have to be questioned. You cannot follow these kinds of things blindly. They have to be questioned. They have to be questioned now as they are happening. I've actually seen people commenting, online saying, "Oh, we can think about this later. Right now, we don't have time to think."
Right.
Yeah, we do need to have time to think right now, because these kind of things can have implications far down the line in other circles. Because the other thing is, remember, we are a nation that is based a great deal on precedents. And when you establish a precedence, that means that precedence can be emulated, and it can be used. It can be used to justify things you never thought it could be used to justify.
Sure. We start with some rules, and then something happens, and pretty soon we're daisy chaining these events. And were those legitimate in the first place? Well, maybe they weren't, but the fact that it's already a precedent means that, well, it must be okay. And the next time it's a little easier.
It's just all that.
And the next
It's
time
just all that much.
easier.
Yes, exactly. It's just all that much easier next time. It's just all that much easier next time. And there are people comparing this very much to the internment of the Japanese in World War II. Because
it's funny. In our first episode, we talked about exactly this example, the internment of the Japanese. We talked about, could we quarantine 100 million people the way the Chinese currently are, or the equivalent, because they quarantined 100 million people, and we have a population that's much smaller than theirs. So we said, okay, 5% of that. So let's say 15 million people. Well, right now, if we're quarantining all of New York City, that's already proportionally more than the Chinese quarantined, if the number 100 million is indeed correct. So I don't know what to make of that.
We're already headed in that direction, because we've got the entire state of California, right, under lockdown. I believe Pennsylvania, New York is headed that way if they're not there already. So I mean, these are big states. So we're already headed in that direction.
Yeah, I understand the fear, because if people won't quarantine themselves, they're endangering everybody around them. And so the thinking is, we have to do this, or else people are going to die. Perhaps 1 million Americans or 2 million Americans could die. And that may sound hyperbolic. A lot of people are going to tell you that couldn't happen. But 2 weeks ago, we didn't think any of this could happen. 2 weeks ago, we thought this was just going to be the flu. And the people who were worrying, the people who were warning that this was going to be a pandemic, that people would be hiding in their houses, that we would shut down the entire economy, that 20 or 30% of the population would be unemployed. This is like nothing else we've lived through.